Great. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Kingston, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council of the National Branch. Our branch has the honor of hosting today's session entitled Putting Public Health at the Heart of Canada's Global Engagement. I come to you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Thank you very much for joining us as we welcome Minister Gould as she outlines her vision for the next chapter in Canada's international development agenda. We are delighted to have you with us, Madam Minister, and are so grateful to you for having chosen as your forum for presentation the National Capital Branch of the CIC as we launch the Global Ambition Project. We are delighted as well to have with us today Campbell Clark, who has kindly agreed to be our moderator for this important hour. I shall introduce Mr. Clark, who will then introduce the Minister. Following her speech, we will open it up to questions for the remaining time allotted. Campbell Clark is the chief political writer for the Globe and Mail. He writes columns, analysis, and features about Canadian politics and government. He has worked as a business reporter, an investigative journalist, a foreign affairs columnist, and a political reporter and columnist. His work has garnered several of Canada's most prestigious journalism awards, including the Michener Award for Public Service in Journalism for the investigative reporting with colleague Daniel LeBlanc that uncovered the sponsorship scandal. Raised in Montreal, he worked for the Gazette and the National Post before the Globe and Mail, and he lives in Ottawa. Campbell, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. And thanks to the CIC for organizing this event. My job obviously will be to introduce your keynote and to pose your questions. But I wanted to just say a few words about the overall theme of this event, of the CIC events series going on, Foreign Policy by Canadians, because in my time at the Globe and Mail, I've written a lot about politics, domestic Canadian politics. That's what I do now. But for a period of years, I was the foreign policy writer. And I think I have some ideas about public opinion on both. So let me just say something about participation in foreign policy. In domestic politics, if you look at opinion polls before an election, you'll see that there's typically about 15% of people that are undecided. And one of the things you learn as you cover politics is that although that number goes down just before election day, it doesn't go down that much. And the reason is those people aren't waffling between whether to choose Liberals or New Democrats or Conservatives. They really are baffled by the whole process. They find it confusing and they throw up their hands and they don't participate. And one of the things I learned when I was writing about foreign policy is that many Canadians, even politically literate Canadians, find it difficult to engage in foreign policy, and they throw up their hands and think it doesn't matter. So when you have conferences like this, when you have events like this, where you're discussing the issues of foreign policy, where people have an opportunity to speak to and question a minister on issues as important as international development, I think that could really have an effect on the participation. So I'm glad that you're here today to take part in this event, and that I'm here to introduce the Minister of International Development, the Honorable Karina Gould, who was elected in 2015 as a Member of Parliament for Burlington at the ripe age, I believe, of 29, and who had, despite her youth, an atypical background in international affairs for Canadian politicians. She had worked in Mexico. She had a degree in political science and Latin American studies from McGill University. She spent a time working at the Organization for American States, and she had a master's in international relations from Oxford. That was all before she was elected as a member of parliament. As a rookie, she was the parliamentary secretary to the Minister for International Development. She was appointed Minister of Democratic Institutions in 2017, and she was appointed Minister of International Development in 2019 at the outset of the Liberal second term. That was about a year ago, and the world has changed quite a bit. If you looked at her mandate letter from less than a year ago, I think you'll see that the top items were to deliver the International Assistance Program and to further the feminist international assistance policy of 2017, but it doesn't mention a pandemic. It doesn't mention all of the things that have happened since that have probably changed our feeling about how international cooperation is working right now. So it's timely to have her here to express her views about the international development agenda going forward. And we'll be looking forward to posing her some questions about that afterwards. So I give you the Minister of International Development, the Honorable Karina Gould. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Campbell. And thank you, Elizabeth, for putting today's event on. I am also very excited about this initiative that CIC is launching to have conversations about Canada's role in the world and foreign policy with Canadians. So as Campbell mentioned, it has been nearly a year since I became Minister of International Development. And if this year has taught me anything, it is the reinforcement of how intricately connected our world is. From security to global health, inequality to climate change, Canada is intimately impacted by what is happening around the world. It says something that the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the World Food Programme this year for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. In the past year, COVID-19 has obviously dominated the agenda. However, its emergence did not put an end to the other humanitarian crises we face in Venezuela or Yemen. It did not put an end to the suffering of the Rohingya, and it did not make Ebola disappear. Over the past decade, we have seen the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance climb from 69 million to over 250 million today. All of these issues, all of the people affected by these crises already needed our help, and COVID-19 only served to compound the challenges they face and make the lives of these millions of vulnerable people even more difficult. It has only increased the strain on a global humanitarian system. In the citation for the World Food Programme, the Norwegian Nobel Committee also wrote that the need for international solidarity and multilateral cooperation is more conspicuous than ever. And I could not agree more, though I realize there are some who disagree, who see this year as a clear indication that Canada should back away from its multilateral commitments and take a more muscular, self-interested approach to the world. As Minister of International Development, I profoundly disagree with either this approach or with the claim that Canada will be better off if we go it alone. Where I think we need to be more intentional is why we believe that multilateralism is the right approach. It is not an end in and of itself. Multilateralism for the sake of multilateralism is not the objective. It is how we use that system to shape a world that is better able to confront the collective challenges we as Canadians, but also as world citizens, face. In the years after the Second World War, the framers of the current international order grappled with how to prevent the world from having to face the same horrors they had just overcome twice. To that end, they built a system that constrained the ambitions of the great powers, that enshrined the sanctity of state sovereignty, and that built up a system of economic linkages that would make war unfeasible. And the current system has, for example, ushered in an era of peace between large powers not seen since the Congress of Vienna. It has delivered a network of economic relationships that have driven poverty down across the world, and it built a foundation for better health outcomes for people everywhere. And what is more, Canada has been a prime beneficiary of this system. However, the challenges we face today are different. Whereas their goal was fundamentally preventative, our goal must be proactive. We must continually seek to renew and strengthen the current rules-based system and to reform specific multilateral institutions so that they can address the challenges of today and tomorrow. Important elements of the current system are under strain and often too slow in addressing intrastate and collective action problems on a global scale. We are seeing more interstate conflicts, more people displaced than ever before, and seeing the rules that govern their treatment come under a sustained attack and have a growing number of states deciding the rules no longer apply. We are seeing attempts to roll back progress that has been made on gender equality and women's rights, and seeing environmental degradation and climate change become epoch-defining threats to our collective existence. In the face of these and other challenges, it is all too tempting to throw up our hands and say, sauve qui peut, to ask what is the point of pursuing Pearsonian diplomacy. Yet it is precisely now that we should be reminding ourselves of what Pearsonian diplomacy is all about. For Pearson, national self-interest and internationalism were two sides of the same coin, because a world that is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more sustainable is ultimately one that is better for Canada. He would often ask that when we think of what kind of Canada we want, we also ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want? In our response to COVID-19, we have the answer. In trying to respond to a collective action problem, over 180 countries have come together to ensure that we prioritize vaccinations amongst the world's most vulnerable through the ACTA Accelerator and its COVAX facility. Likewise, Canadian efforts to encourage multilateral solutions to the economic recovery necessary to support developing countries struggling with the implications of the pandemic. Neither effort is perfect, but it's better than going in alone because the alternative is a much riskier, much more dangerous, much bleaker, and much lonelier road to travel. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak with Mary Robinson. And in reflecting on the lessons COVID-19 can teach us, she summed up what I believe we must take away from this experience. That governance matters, that science matters, that compassion matters, that collective action matters, and that when individuals change their behavior, they can shape outcomes for a coordinated effect. This has been true across the world as we have seen how different countries have been able to manage, or not, the COVID-19 outbreak within their borders. It is this concept of working for the people of the world that is capturing my imagination right now. The challenges we face today are collective threats to humanity: climate change, health, inequality. If nothing else, COVID-19 has shown that no matter how much we may try to insulate ourselves from the world, we are intimately and intricately connected. To meet these collective challenges, I believe we are going to require coordinated multilateral action. And it is against this backdrop that I want to share with you my priorities for Canada's international development over the next decade as we drive towards advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. I truly believe that we have a real opportunity to reshape the international order to better address issues demanding collective action for the benefit of Canadians and the world's most vulnerable people. Firstly, we will remain committed to our feminist approach. While this isn't new, it is fundamental. And as I've discovered in many of the conversations I've had over the past 9 months, it is apparently revolutionary to stay the course. So perhaps I can explain why I think doggedly pursuing the full implementation of the Feminist International Assistance Policy is so significant. At the most basic level, the FIAP is significant because it changes the way Canada makes decisions about its international development assistance. It places the issue of gender equality at the center of Canada's thinking by committing 15% of our development assistance to projects that are focused on advancing equality. By doing this, we are changing the systems that discriminate against half the population, and it is by changing these long entrenched structures that we will achieve greater peace, security, and prosperity. However, it isn't just about gender equality. That's obviously an important part, but it goes beyond that. Our feminist approach means that we must identify, address, and transform power dynamics. It means taking an intersectional, human rights-based approach. It means concerted and intentional anti-racist action in our programming and processes. It means seeking out the most vulnerable and most marginalized and supporting their voices. Second, we will carry forward Canada's long-standing commitment to and leadership in global health, and continue to build and support an architecture that delivers for everyone. This means driving our achievements all the way to that last mile. In the context of COVID-19, this means addressing the pandemic as directly as possible by ensuring that there is equitable access to vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. That is why Canada is playing a leadership role in the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility. We have contributed $120 million to the ACT Accelerator and $440 million to COVAX, split equally between its self-financing mechanism and its advanced market commitment. And it's worth noting that the COVAX facility now represents the largest multilateral collaboration since the Paris Climate Accord. There are 186 participants representing over 85% of the global population, including 94 self-financing participants. This is an example of not only how multilateralism can work, but why it matters in the face of global challenges like a pandemic. However, despite the accomplishment that the mere establishment of these mechanisms represent, we remain at a critical juncture in the area of global health as systems around the world are under incredible and growing pressure, and the weaknesses in existing systems are being revealed. We can clearly see, as a result of COVID-19, the terrible effects not having access to healthcare can have, so we need to commit ourselves to working towards achieving universal access. We can already see the devastating impacts of the numerous life-saving interventions that have been halted or delayed due to COVID-19. Immunization campaigns, nutrition interventions, and community approaches to healthcare have been tested and refined in recent decades and saved millions of lives. It is unconscionable to think that we are losing ground across so many fronts, especially as we enter the UN Decade of Delivery for the SDGs. As I said earlier, the fundamental challenge of COVID-19 in the developing world is that it is compounding and exacerbating almost every single other health challenge, often in sharply different ways. Additionally, over the course of this pandemic, we have seen just how closely healthcare and human rights are interconnected. We have seen how some have chosen to exploit this moment to roll back essential healthcare services in the name of COVID-19 management. Lockdowns may be containing the spread, yet they are also leading to disturbing spikes in sexual and gender-based violence, as well as violence and exploitation of children and youth. And this is why I have also paid particular attention to continuity of education and working with partner countries to safely reopen schools when it is possible, as schools often represent safe places for girls and boys. We know how vital education is to their current and future well-being. Additionally, millions of women and girls around the world are now facing acute challenges to their sexual and reproductive health and rights. This is compounded by medical supply chains being redirected in support of PPE and testing, but often at the cost of other essential services and supplies, such as family planning, access to contraception, and access to safe and legal abortion, as well as post-abortion care. As we move forward, we must continue to work towards truly integrating sexual and reproductive health and rights, including in emergencies, into health systems around the world. Driving our results forward also means shining a spotlight on those SDGs that have not received the same kind of attention that others have. SDG 2 is an example of this. We know that as a result of the pandemic, the number of food insecure people, 690 million people this year, may rise by as much as 130 million people by the end of 2020. According to WFP, if current trends continue, the number of hungry people will reach 840 million by 2030. Malnutrition will likely also exacerbate the COVID-19 impacts on mothers and children. We have seen how fragile food systems and supply chains truly are, and the devastating effects that can have. We will do more to help end chronic malnutrition. Third, we will do our part to tackle climate change. Though COVID-19 has rocked the world, its effects, while undeniably terrible, pale in comparison to the existential threat climate change represents, particularly for the poorest and most vulnerable, who we know will feel its effects most acutely. I would remind us all that these are also the people who have contributed the least to the problem. This must offend our most basic sense of fairness. Our goal is nothing less than to build a world that is nature positive and carbon neutral. This means we are going to drive more resources to least developed countries and diversify our implementing partners. It means we are going to integrate climate, nature, and biodiversity thinking into our work and ensure that our programming takes an intersectional feminist approach to fighting climate change. In part, this means doing more to help those who are already being affected by climate change. For instance, we know that changing weather patterns are placing increased strain on an already stressed food system in the form of less productive land, crops that are no longer suited to the conditions, and an increased burden on those who are responsible for food production. In sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of the smallholder farmers who support the food system are women. For them, climate change isn't an impending tidal wave. For them, it has already swept up the beach. We also know that as humanity encroaches on the natural world at an alarming rate, we are putting both our lives and livelihoods at greater risk. Zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 are thought to be related to our continual expansion into wild spaces. We need to make serious, sustained investments in sustainable agriculture, in conservation, in disaster risk mitigation measures, and of course, in clean energy. And we have started to make those investments. In 2016, Canada committed $2.65 billion to reducing greenhouse gases internationally. And we are already starting to see returns on these investments. To date, we estimate that Canada's investments are expected to result in 176 megatons in greenhouse gas reductions. What is more, our projects are making a difference on the ground. For instance, earlier this year, the Government of Canada partnered with the Caribbean Development Bank to establish the Canada CARICOM Climate Adaptation Fund, which will help promote resilience in the region by helping to pay the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility insurance premiums for 9 countries in the region. In the current context, this will help free up fiscal space to help finance their response to COVID-19, but will also help make sure they are able to rebuild after the next catastrophic hurricane season. Building off the conversations I've had with stakeholders here in Canada and around the world, we have learned important lessons from this first wave of programming. We know that women and farmers are on the front line of the battle to fight climate change. Ensuring our programming responds to their needs, both in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but also adapting to the realities of a changing climate, will be a guiding principle of how we move forward. Additionally, we recognize the important role that nature plays in absorbing carbon, and I am excited about incorporating nature-based solutions into our future work. Working with local communities, Indigenous people, and women's activists will help ensure that we build lasting solutions to the climate crisis. While the world is rightfully concerned with the impact of the pandemic on development gains, the impact that climate change will have is even more worrisome. We will work in partnership and led by local communities to ensure that they not only benefit from our climate investments, but are also key agents in the solution. And fourth, to achieve this, we also need to focus our efforts on shoring up democratic governance. It is becoming clear that there is a direct relationship between citizens' trust in their governing institutions and their willingness to follow their advice peacefully. Furthermore, transparency and accountability in the provision of health data are paramount for national governments and the world community to effectively respond to the current pandemic. We must remain steadfast in our commitment to upholding human rights. It is in times of crisis that civil liberties, freedom of expression, and a free press are most important. We know how much functioning public institutions matter to sustainable development. Canada has a lot to offer the world when it comes to cooperation on governance. Rule of law, tax administration, and wealth redistribution, professional and competent public service. This is maybe not one of the sexier topics in international development, but it is certainly one of the most important. Often, governance work can have one of the most meaningful impacts in fostering a governance environment that creates the conditions for rights, democratic participation, economic growth, and sustainable practices to flourish. Effective governance is also necessary for developing countries to attract private capital investment, which is important for enabling inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Now, listening to this, I realize it seems ambitious. Health, nutrition, climate and the environment, food security, gender equality, education, and governance. It's definitely a lot, but what we know is you can't do any of these things in isolation. They are all intricately connected, so to try and address one without addressing the others won't lead to success. When I think back to Mary Robinson's lessons from our response to COVID-19, governance matters, compassion matters, science matters, and collective action matters, I reflect on how well each of those insights applies to each of the areas I mentioned above. It gives me tremendous hope for the future because it also says to me that we know what we need to do, and knowing is half the battle. Now we have to act and respond. Certainly, Canada cannot achieve this all on our own, but we can build coalitions and we can work with existing and new partners, allies, friends the world over through our multilateral institutions and outside of them to keep advancing our shared priorities because our collective health, security, prosperity, and quite frankly, survival depends on it. Now, I know it can be uncomfortable within the development community to suggest that development is part of our foreign policy. But Canadian foreign policy is focused on creating opportunities for Canada and Canadians to shape the world we want to live in. Our development work is doing this in action. And the FIAP, grounded in feminism, grounded in inclusivity, grounded in human rights and sustainability, is an incredible achievement to building a better, more compassionate and resilient world. I think more than anything right now, with the twin crises of COVID and climate, which in many places around the world are worsened by conflict, we all need a little hope. And the objectives and priorities we seek to advance in the world should come from the basic premise that a better world is possible. It is not naively idealistic to pursue an agenda that tries to make life healthier, more just, equitable, and sustainable for people around the globe. It is grounded in the realities and the constraints we face as actors in the global system. But just because the world is a harsh place doesn't mean we should abandon the pursuit of trying to make it a little better. That's why multilateralism is still relevant today. It is why Pearsonian diplomacy is still relevant today. And certainly that is what Canada's international assistance is all about. So back over to you, Campbell, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate that. I will be posing a couple of questions off the top. We're going to get the ball rolling, but I want to remind everybody to use the Q&A button to pose questions. I will voice them for you, but I will voice your questions. And I guess the first thing I wanted to ask, you said it was a lot. It is a lot. There are a lot of priorities. And then you mentioned the disruptiveness of this pandemic and COVID-19. So will that get in the way? Is it an obstacle to delivering the assistance? And is there a mood of less cooperation in the world because of the feeling of global crisis that we've seen that is going to get in the way of delivering international assistance and development programs over the next few years? Is it going to get in the way of your priorities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think what we have seen because of COVID is, especially earlier in the year, in March and April, when we didn't really know we still don't really know what's happening, but we really didn't know, what was going to happen and how this was going to impact development, that there was a bit of a pause in terms of, the rollout of programming. But then, partners, both CSOs, multilaterals, partner countries, pivoted very quickly, and we're actually able to continue rolling out a lot of the programming that I mentioned in my remarks and deliver on the priorities. But what we are seeing is setbacks, and we're seeing setbacks because of some of the measures that have come into play. Here in Canada, we obviously feel the economic impact of, when we have to shut things down and take a pause. But I would argue that the impact is even greater in the developing world, where you don't necessarily have government programs that can come in and provide support to people who are no longer, able to work. And the way one of my colleagues framed it to me was, people in my country are deciding whether to die of COVID or die of starvation because they don't have the option, right? And so when you think about it in that way, I mean, the economic impact and burden that so many people in the developing world are facing is so great. And that's why, the WFP's kind of clarion call about, we need to address the hunger crisis because people are facing starvation at an alarming rate is so important. And it's why, we do need to focus on those basic deliverables, but at the same time, we can't ignore the other issues. I mean, the fact that children aren't in school still in a number of countries means that they're estimating there's 10 million girls who just will never go back to school, right? Because they might have to help out at home. They might get pregnant. They might be forced into an early marriage to help with family finances. There's a whole range of issues that are being exacerbated. So yes, COVID is a huge challenge. And we are seeing real-time setbacks, but at the same time, we are also working with our partners on the ground to continue delivering these really important interventions. And the other one that I'm particularly concerned about is with regards to immunization campaigns. So, in many parts of the world, particularly in the spring, I think it's I should know the number, but I believe it's millions of children that have missed out on routine vaccinations this year. And that's a huge concern. I think particularly of when I was in the DRC in January, visiting to see the Ebola response, and the fact that while 3,000 people tragically lost their lives to Ebola, 6,000 children in the DRC were lost to a measles outbreak at the same time, right? And we didn't hear about that, and so these are the kinds of issues that we're facing. But I don't think it has lessened the resolve of the world to cooperate. In fact, I think we've actually seen some really exciting, innovative mechanisms like the COVAX facility, right? That has never been done before to try and ensure that we can A, deal with this pandemic, but B, make sure that we are still, confronting and trying to address some of these pre-existing challenges as well.
That is an example, I think, of where people might have a different impression, though. That is an international initiative, but we have heard for months now of countries competing to get the first vials of vaccine to their own populations. And you'd have to expect that it's not going to be developing countries that are going to be first in line for those things in some ways. You were speaking just a few moments ago about the rules-based international system developed after the Second World War, and development agencies and development assistance was part of that. I think we've had a feeling internationally that the rules-based international order was weakened in the last few years. Certainly people said that the United States under Donald Trump was withdrawing from that. Have we seen, in your view, any sort of change in that rules-based international order and its commitment to international development? I know that's a broad question, so let me put it in a specific way as well. If we're competing for vaccines, can we be cooperating on vaccines?
So I think the answer to that is actually yes, because what COVAX is doing, which is novel about it, is it's trying to access vaccines for developed and developing countries at the same time. And what is innovative about that is that, they are entering into agreements with, a wide range of different, vaccine producers, that some of whom are the same as the ones that we have bilateral deals with, but some of whom are different as well. And the idea is to pool that risk within the COVAX facility, because we know that not all of these vaccine candidates are going to be successful. And the agreements that they have in place through COVAX, those are priority agreements. And the idea is that if you have a facility that is going to secure vaccines for 20% of the world's population, or 20% of the countries that join it, that means that you have a strategy that is looking to vaccinate people all around the world, at around the same time, right? And that is really different and really innovative. And there's 186 countries that are part of that. So yes, there are still some countries that aren't, but 186 is a pretty cool and impressive number. And 74 of those are self-financing. So it's not perfect, absolutely, but I think it is really neat, and it is really innovative. And Canada has been at the forefront of trying to get this going on the facilitation group, on the leadership, and really pushing actively to make this a success.
One more question from me, and then I'm going to take the questions from the people who have come to see you. There is, in your first days as an MP, the Prime Minister went to Paris for the Paris Summit. There was a big part of the Canadian announcements at that summit was about international assistance. And part of the idea was that there had to be some kind of transfer of wealth and technology in order to make an international climate accord work. A lot's happened since then. Donald Trump pulled out. Apparently, Joe Biden's going to be back in January. There's going to be a COP26 summit, I guess, postponed by a year next November. And the idea is supposed to be that countries are going to increase their ambition and their goals. But what about the transfer of wealth, technology, and assistance that's supposed to make developing countries able to take part in that as well?
Well, so I mean, that was part of our initial climate financing commitment, the 2.65 billion over the first 5 years. And I mean, a lot of that has gone towards multilateral development banks that are working in developing countries to build clean infrastructure, to reduce greenhouse gases, to do that technical knowledge transfer as well. And that's certainly going to factor into our next tranche of climate financing that we're working on right now. And of course, in the lead up to COP, there's going to be lots of there's going to be lots of conversations ongoing at the international level, and I've had some really kind of exciting conversations with my UK counterparts who are co-hosting with Italy next year, and a real commitment. And I think that one of the kind of taglines of the international response to COVID has been building back greener, building back cleaner. And, I always like to say rebuilding or building forward, but in that, we need to use this moment as well to really, kind of press reset on, what we're doing with regards to climate change. And I think there is a real commitment, and Canada has also been leading with the UN and Jamaica on our financing for the SDGs as well. So lots of conversations that are going to happen over the next year, but I think the world is really kind of, in terms of we're responding to COVID-19, but we also recognize that we have to deal with climate change.
Okay. So I'm going to read some of the questions that have been brought to you. So here's one from Paul Meyer, which is, why did the Feminist International Assistance Policy ignore arms control and disarmament issues? Many of the armaments that diplomacy tries to address have a disproportionate impact on women and girls.
Well, it's a great question. And unfortunately, I'm going to answer in a bit of a technocratic way, in that the way that global affairs is kind of delineated between trade, foreign affairs, and development. Disarmament is really under the foreign affairs bubble. And so when we were doing the Feminist International Assistance Policy, we focused on what was under the remit of development. But as I'm sure you are aware, we have also committed to having a feminist foreign policy. And I know that Minister Champagne is reviewing this work right now. And it's a good way to feed into it. And I would say that, some of the work on terms of the accession to the Arms Trade Treaty, as well as the work that we're doing in women, peace and security, and our fantastic WSP ambassador, Jackie O'Neill, as well as some of the more recent decisions with regards to arms trading are fully reflective of that feminist approach.
Okay. This is maybe a slightly to the side of the development topic, but it's probably related to disarmament in a strange way. And I apologize if I read this name wrong, because my eyes don't read small print as well as they used to, but I believe the name is Irfane Fancy, and she says, are we also going to emphasize peacekeeping again in the world?
Are we, sorry?
Also going to emphasize peacekeeping again in the world.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, well, we have done a number of things on peacekeeping, the ELSI initiative being one that is very important, but with regards to encouraging and supporting women peacekeepers. And this is, an ongoing conversation in terms of, Canada's role in the world. And we also most recently wrapped up a very important peace operation mission in Mali, but these are very much ongoing conversations.
Right. Here's one from Taylor Lepic. Hi, Minister Gould. Thanks so much for today's keynote presentation. I appreciated you, oops, I just lost it there. I appreciated you touching on the intersectional feminist approach to climate change. Can you speak a bit more as to what this approach looks like when developing a response to COVID-19?
To climate change and COVID-19? Okay,
No.
I'll do my best. So in terms of our intersectional feminist approach, I'll start with climate change. I think the first one is really recognizing that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so whether you're a small scale farmer in Africa or someone who has to get the water, or you're seeing how drought or extreme weather is impacting your family's ability to have a livelihood or go to school, women are often facing the greater brunt. And so really recognizing that, I think, is A, important, and then B, making sure that when we're doing our climate programming, we are taking intersectionality into account. We are understanding how different levels and different levels of discrimination can impact somebody's experience, and also making sure that they are benefiting from our programming. So recognizing that the projects that we do will have different impacts based on your gender, perhaps based on your race, your socioeconomic status, and what your position is within the community and the country that you live in. So that's part of what we're doing. The other part that I think is important and exciting is greater work with Indigenous communities around the world in terms of how they are responding to climate change, and recognizing that I think the statistic is, and don't quote me on this, but I believe it's 70% of the remaining natural spaces in the world are in Indigenous lands, right? And so how can we continue to work and support the work of Indigenous peoples in protecting those spaces, and also protecting the activism that they do as well. And then in terms of responding to COVID-19, again, it's understanding how people, based on their intersecting identities, are impacted by COVID-19. And so, it's understanding that, if one important one is for LGBTQ communities, their ability to access healthcare in a number of places is often challenged. And so what can we do to make sure that they continue to have access to healthcare? Understanding that women, again, are disproportionately impacted because not only do they have to maintain an income, but when schools are closed, they're often the ones that are charged with childcare as well, or elder care, or caring for the sick. And so understanding all of those intersecting realities in our programming is what we aspire to.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question now that I think is a twist on sort of question that development ministers have been asked about the way Canadian government works for quite some time. So this is from Jocelyn Clark. You mentioned that there's a tension between international development and foreign policy, but you say there's a need for a whole of government approach. As you know, this is me interjecting now, but as you know, that this has been a question for a long time. Should foreign policy and development be separate? Should they flavor each other, and so on? But what she's asking is, can I ask you about any obstacles or challenges for you in getting traditional trade or finance ministries on board with progressive health principles like feminism and intersectionality?
Yeah, so I guess I referenced the tension because I think it's one that is present within the development community. I don't necessarily see it as such, in the sense that I think that development and foreign affairs, development is part of our foreign policy, and it also helps us actually achieve in action what some of our foreign policy objectives are. But in terms of getting finance ministries and trade ministries on board, certainly not right now, because I have two extraordinarily feminist colleagues, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Trade, and we work extraordinarily well together on this. I think part of the challenge sometimes is reaching a bit deeper into the bureaucracy to get everybody on board with it and moving this agenda forward. But certainly at the top level right now at Finance and Trade, there is a concerted commitment to advancing feminist priorities and policies and programming in the development space. And so it's quite an exciting time to be a development minister, actually.
So I'm going to jump in and ask one of my own questions now to move off of that previous question, which is, for a long time, people have had that debate about governments, whether development should further a foreign policy and in some ways, crassly further foreign policy, as in it will improve our standing with this government or that government. And there is a law in place, I believe still in place, that the goal of Canada's international assistance should be eradicating poverty. What do you think the public is telling you, since we're here to talk in a series about foreign policy by Canadians? What do they want? Do they want development assistance that is focused on eradicating poverty, or do they think, this should help Canadians? It should help our image, our foreign policy goals, our trade. What do you think the Canadians want?
I think they want both. And I would say that maybe my view of foreign policy is less crass than yours might be, Campbell, in the sense that I think that, our foreign policy objective is also, so it's about creating a world that is fairer, more just, more equitable, and more inclusive. And in order to, and that will also help advance Canada's objectives. And I think that, our development assistance is absolutely doing that. And yes, the ODAAA Act is still in place, and it guides everything that we do in terms of, making sure that we are reaching the most vulnerable and assisting the poorest as well. And I think that by doing that, we inherently enhance Canada's image, because we are a trusted, compassionate partner and ally for people around the world. And so maybe that's a slightly different view of how some people may understand foreign policy, but I think that they really do go hand in hand. But I think us acting in a way that is consistent with our values and principles inherently builds up Canada's reputation.
Okay, I've got a bunch more here. So Lauren Nielsen asks, what is one area where Canada's delivery in international development has been strong? And what is one area where Canada's delivery is struggling in effectiveness? And please provide both.
Sure. Well, I would like to say that we do excellent development work. And I would also like to note that I think the professionals at Global Affairs Canada who work in development are just absolutely top notch and care so passionately and deeply about the work that they do. I think one of the areas where Canada has demonstrated incredible leadership over the decades is in global health. When it comes to the work that we did in eradicating polio, I mean, we still have that last mile to go, but really, Canada's leadership in that is extraordinary, and that spans decades and political parties, and then I would say that, we carry on with that, whether it's our support to immunization campaigns, to sexual and reproductive health and rights, or to other health objectives. Overall, the work that we've done to fight malaria, TB, and AIDS is another, shining example. I would also say, if I can, that we are doing really well when it comes to gender equality. Since the FIAP in the last 3 years, we've become the top OECD donor in gender equality. So, I think when Canada sets our mind to something, we can truly and really accomplish it. So that's really good. And this is an area where I wouldn't say we're struggling in the sense that our programming isn't doing well, but I think my objective over the coming years is to really make sure that our climate financing and our feminist international assistance policy are more aligned. Our climate financing was announced before the FIAP, and so really making sure that over the coming years we better integrate gender equality and intersectionality into climate financing, I think is really important. So I wouldn't say that we're struggling on climate financing. I'm just going to say that I think can do a better job moving forward.
What about delivery, though? Are there reviews where you say, this isn't working, we're going to get rid of that program?
Well, we were kind of going to start that process before COVID hit. And so that is something that is ongoing, but absolutely. I mean, all of our international assistance is reviewed on a regular basis. One thing that we changed when we came into government, which I think was the right thing to do, was the previous government's focus on trying to, and maybe this is where the foreign policy development conversation is challenging, because the previous government specifically tried to do development to make it easier for Canadian mining in country X, right? I think we realized that working with Canadian mining companies and CSOs made it quite a bit of a challenge, and that's not something that we carried forward with, and didn't necessarily achieve the objectives of the OD AAA Act. And so that's certainly something. And then we're constantly reviewing programs and shifting them to make sure that we're being as effective as possible and getting to those who need it most.
Here's one from Suzanne Courtney. Minister, please tell us when Global Affairs Canada will announce and fund financing for private capital for development, and what will it look like?
I'm going to assume that she's referring to the International Assistance Innovation Program.
Not clear to me.
It's not clear. That I think is maybe what it is. But that is a program that was announced in 2018 and that we are currently going through in terms of allocations. That one, I'll be honest, has been a bit more of a challenge, mostly because of the impact of COVID, and we haven't been able to give it the same kind of attention that we would have otherwise. But I think we recognize that official development assistance on its own is not going to be sufficient to reach, the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals, which is why the Prime Minister has been leading this initiative at the United Nations with Prime Minister Holness of Jamaica and the UN Secretary General, and really, trying to work within, the multilateral development banks, but also, the OECD DAC to make sure that we're still maintaining, the objectives of ODA, but also trying to bring in new sources of finance. And Canada has been doing some interesting initiatives that work with some of the global multilateral partners to also raise capital on private markets as well. And we've actually spearheaded some of this work over the past few years.
Okay. Here's one from WUSC, the FIA, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, is a highly pertinent framework for our work in so many areas, including better health, education, and economic outcomes in the context of serious action on climate change. What about refugees who are affected by climate change, social and political fragility, and global investments in education, health, etc.? How should refugees feature in our international development agenda, given Canada's leadership in this area?
An excellent question, and thank you to WUSC for it. Refugees obviously play a very important role in Canada's international development assistance. We're one of the top donors to UNHCR, and we work with WUSC and other groups in the Canadian Partnership for Innovation and Education Working Group to look at this. And that in my mandate letter from the Prime Minister last year, one of the items that I was tasked with was leading a global campaign for education for displaced children, including refugees and internally displaced children. And we are working with UNHCR and organizations like Education Cannot Wait and other NGOs to make sure that we are really doing our part to get refugee children into education, but also making sure that our programming is listening to what their needs are and responding to what their needs are. On climate change, this is a really interesting conversation. Was it just in June when the United Nations did agree that individuals could perhaps claim refugee status because of climate change. And so this is a really interesting area of thought and policy work right now, and one that I'm looking forward to engaging on more.
All right. Here is a question from Don Scott. I'm going to read the first part and paraphrase the second. You mentioned Canada's contributions leading to a reduction of GHGs, greenhouse gases, in the developing world. How do you square that with our government's push to expand our exports of fossil fuels? He mentioned specifically LNG exports, adding to greenhouse gas emissions, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and so on. How do you square that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think it's one that many countries are grappling with, in the sense that we all recognize we need to reduce greenhouse gases, and we also need to ensure a transition as well. And of course, many jurisdictions in Canada rely heavily on the production of oil or natural gas. And so, we also recognize that we need to work with them to transition away from those natural resources. But also, when it comes to natural gas, recognizing that that is a cleaner source than oil. And so making investments in cleaner sources of energy is important. And then, working with developing countries, which was one of the asks from the Paris Climate Agreement, was to make sure that, wealthier nations helped contribute and share resources and knowledge to reduce greenhouse gases in the developing world. So this is absolutely an ongoing conversation, but I can say for me personally, the reason why I got into politics was to try and fight climate change and to do our part around the world. And so I'm very excited to be leading these efforts internationally.
All right. Here's a question from Michael Kerr. Hello, Minister Gould. Very welcome is the fact that the federal government is slowly building and engaging a racial justice lens and agenda here in Canada. How is this being reflected internationally through the work and efforts of your office?
Thanks, Michael, for that question. And this is something that I've been very engaged with over the past few months. And I mentioned it in my earlier remarks in terms of making sure that our work internationally is not just feminist, but it's intersectional and it's anti-racist. And I think that's really important. And so it's another thing for us to really be focused on in our development work. It's why taking an intersectional lens and approach is so important, to really understand what impact our programming will have on different individuals and groups within communities. It's making sure that we are being intentionally inclusive and asking really tough questions of partners. And this is a conversation that I had just recently with staff at Global Affairs Canada as well, to really look at our work and really understand and do the hard work necessary to make sure that we are being anti-racist in our work right around the world, and also in how we carry and comport ourselves as representatives of Canada. And the other thing that I think is important too, and I know that all of the global affairs ministers are very keen on this and intentional in it, is making sure that who represents Canada abroad looks like Canada at home.
All right. We have a question and a comment from Monty McMurchie. Canadian aid development assistance to be effective needs to be deployed to local-based entities instead of reliance on parochial Canadian name-branded vanity-type organizations with elegant Toronto offices. He names a few here. Me, War Child Canada, Journalists for Human Rights, I am not endorsing his views with those organizations because I don't know, but I'm asking you, is there a point there? Does the Canadian development assistance deliver aid through our own organizations that have a high profile rather than going to more effective local organizations?
Well, what I would, sorry,
Elizabeth.
Minister Gould, excuse me, and if I may, Campbell, if this may be the last question, because I'm very cognizant of the time and wrapping up and very appreciative of the conversation. Please proceed. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So what I would say is, we have some absolutely extraordinary Canadian civil society organizations that do really good work around the world. And what many of those organizations would do is work with local partners to deliver that assistance. And what is a priority for me and a priority for the Feminist International Assistance Policy is making sure that we are building local capacity. I feel that COVID-19 has really clarified that local capacity is and knowledge transfer is fundamental to long-term development gains, and that is a fundamental pillar of the work that we do. And in fact, we committed to it at the humanitarian summit in Istanbul in 2016, and the grand bargain commitment of working with more local actors and doing that work. So that is part of the decision making when we receive projects, be it through a Canadian civil society organization, an international organization, or a multilateral organization, is how they work with local partners on the ground. And so, that really is important and foundational for the work that we do.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I did lose track of time a little bit here, I guess, with all of these questions, and there's still several more that people want to pose, but clearly there isn't going to be time for that. Thank you very much for taking all these questions, including mine, and for outlining your priorities here today. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more questions for you after this in other fora, but based on your speech today. But thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time. Elizabeth, did you want to say a few words to thank the minister?
Elizabeth, you're muted.
There we go. I'm muting myself. There we go. I would like to thank you, Minister Gould. My goodness, as you can see, the generation of the questions that have come about as a result of your speech that lays out the vision so encompassing in so many areas that are of great importance to us as individuals and to Canada as a nation, and very much the perspective that Canada offers in the world. It is really tremendous that you were able to share that vision with us today, and thank you very, very much. And Campbell, thank you very much for your able moderating skills and being able to bring together the numerous questions and interests that this debate has sparked by Canadians from coast to coast. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your talent and lending your voice to the CIC today as part of this Global Ambition project. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
On that note, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.